Welcome back to our conversation about stereotype threats, what a computing faculty needs to know. So, in our first segment, we talked about what stereotype threat is, that it's caused by an awareness of a negative stereotype about you. Whether or not you believe the stereotype will impede your performance. And we showed some papers that discuss that we can verify that this exists by changing people's awareness of stereotypes. But that works in a clinical setting. In practice, what we want to do is reduce the impact of stereotype threats for our students in the real world. So we're going to talk about the three basic vectors we can go, right? We can try to reduce awareness, we can try to reduce the negative stereotype, or we can try to reduce the ability to which a particular student agrees with the stereotype, the about you. First, though, let's talk about something you shouldn't do. Many people are tempted to myth bust, to try to directly provide contrary evidence to the stereotype. And this can backfire in a fairly major way. For example, if I were to say, I know that you've heard that people that have small feet don't swim well, but it's not true. We've measured many people swimming, and people with small feet swim just as well as people with big feet. And this is a useful statement in the fact that I'm telling you the stereotype is false, except the message that I get across is that clearly enough people thought that small feet caused bad swimming that it was worth my while not only telling you about it, but other people's while studying that it wasn't true. So I may have convinced you perhaps not to believe this stereotype, but I have instilled in your mind an awareness that many people do believe it, and thus created an environment for stereotype threat. In this case, out of whole cloth, because the stereotype I created for this example didn't exist. Yet nonetheless, if we were to now measure you swimming, those of you who self-identify as having smaller feet would do less well because you would have somewhere in the back of your mind this awareness of this stereotype about small feet people not swimming well. So direct myth-busting almost always backfires because it creates this sense that everybody else must believe it. And so sometimes people try this indirect method of providing direct contrary evidence, right? So I might say, our fastest swimmer was this person with really tiny feet. And this also creates this sense that it's remarkable that somebody with small feet would swim well, that it's worth saying something about it. So it can still create or reinforce an awareness of a stereotype just in my pointing this out. So myth-busting is almost never a good way of reducing a stereotype threat. Now remember in the first module we said stereotypes have other negative effects besides stereotype threat, and this can be a tactic for some of those, so it's a mixed bag. But let's talk about some techniques that work particularly well for stereotype threat. So if we want to reduce awareness, or to reduce the stereotype itself, or reduce the sense of belonging, those are our options. So we want to start by countering the stereotype. Instead of myth-busting, what we can do is provide sort of a stereotype-neutral counter-stereotype evidence. For example, instead of telling somebody that this individual got the highest score in the exam, I can just provide the full grade distribution, how well everybody in the course did in an anonymized fashion, so that the threatened students can notice that they are not performing below par. They can see for themselves the evidence that the stereotype is false. I can also try to discuss the contributions of people who are atypical. I can point out individuals who do not fit the mold of the discipline under discussion. Right? So I can point out that some of the great luminaries in early computing history were gays and females that were not typically seen as being part of how computing worked, but nonetheless existed. And just by talking about them, I can raise awareness that they are part of the conversation without ever needing to say people expected them not to be. Another technique that can work to some degree with counting stereotypes, though it can be difficult to do correctly, is to express surprise when others raise a stereotype. Not to lie, not to pretend like you've never heard this stereotype, but to express that you were surprised that others would think the stereotype had any validity and was worth bringing up, right? So when somebody says, I don't expect to do well in this course, I'm a whatever the negative stereotype group of the day is, instead of saying, it's all right, and people like that do well, we can say, what does that have to do with it? And that initial expression of surprise can help them recognize that the stereotype is both not true and not universally held. We can also reduce the degree to which individuals relate to the stereotype. We don't want to do this by invalidating their existing identities, right? if I say to somebody, oh, I don't see race or gender or age or whatever it is, then I am insulting people with that characteristic, and they will often see it as such. It's not necessarily a positive way of going about. But everybody has multiple identities, and so I can strive to cultivate other identities, right? I can try to cultivate identity as a computer scientist, as a student, some of these positive identities that do not have a negative stereotype. And by having them key off of those instead of off of some of their other identities, they're less likely to be aware and thinking about the stereotype threat. This sense of identity typically comes at the end of a sequence, right? We start with interest, then confidence, and then belonging, and then finally identity. And this is talked somewhat in the active recruiting modules about how these differ. But in general, as we're interacting with students, you want to try to move them closer to a positive identity and key more off of that. We'll also talk some more about this in mindset in another segment of this module. So we can try to reduce the stereotypes, we can try to reduce how much people relate to it, but we can also try to reduce the impact of it. And this is one we'll have several additional segments on various ideas here. Not all students are equally impacted by stereotype threat. And this has been studied a fairly large degree. So some groups that we've studied have a low impact categories. If we tell people that a test is fair, that this particular activity they're engaging in does not reflect the stereotype, this tends to work. But this only works if it's unusual, right? If I try to make that the norm, people stop believing me. I can try to reduce belonging uncertainty by helping people feel like they fit in. I can affirm personal values. I can try to normalize the academic struggle. I can state my confidence in the student. And I can try to develop belief in the incremental growth of intelligence. Each of these deserves a little bit of conversation, and so we'll have an additional segment on each. But this is an overview of what we can do to try to bridge and reduce stereotype threat by reducing awareness of stereotypes, by reducing the stereotype themselves, and reducing the impact it is likely to have on our students.